I've heard of players being reclamation projects, but is Atlanta now the place where all the coaches go as reclamation projects?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network on the planet. And if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. In today's episode, we will be talking about the decision behind the Falcons bringing in another failed assistant coach, this time in special teams coordinator, assistant special teams coach, Chase Blackburn. And what does that mean? Is Kevin Stefanski now doing this on purpose? Is he basically saying challenge accepted? And we'll also talk about Jeff Ulbrich's philosophy on players versus scheme and why his philosophy is the correct philosophy, but why it could go a little bit too far. But let's start off talking about the latest coaching hire that the Falcons announced late Wednesday, which is Chase Blackburn, formerly the special teams coordinator of the LA Rams. For those of you that need a quick rundown of Blackburn's resume, played for many years with the Giants and Panthers in the NFL as a linebacker and special teams guy. Then very shortly after sort of ending his NFL career, joined the Panthers coaching staff, worked his way up to be the full-time special teams coordinator starting in 2018, served that role under Ron Rivera, and then Matt Rule through the 2021 season, was dismissed, joined the Titans in 2022, where he was the assistant special teams coach under then special teams coordinator Craig Ackerman. Same dynamic they'll have here in Atlanta. And then after that point was able to join the LA Rams in 23, where he served as the special teams coordinator for the last 3 years, and then got fired the week before the Falcons played the Rams in week 17 due to the sort of disastrous special teams performances from that team. And, for those that need a refresher, the general perception of the Rams season this year is like the only thing that was holding back that team was their special teams this year, and they could have potentially been the number one seed had their special teams not held back. At least that's the narrative, whether you buy that narrative or not. I'm not here to tell you the correct answer on that, but no one was more sick watching the Seahawks win the Super Bowl than probably Rams fans, knowing that, man, if we just had decent special teams, we could have been the one seed in the butterfly effect. We could have won another Super Bowl and whatnot. But, we talk, when you look at Chase Blackburn's history, not just most recently with the Rams, a lot of those special teams units that he had in Carolina were also not particularly well regarded either. And so you have this history of just another one of these coaches that doesn't have necessarily a great resume, that's coming to Atlanta hoping to kind of resurrect themselves, be a reclamation project. And we've joked before where it feels like Kevin Stefanski is collecting the infinity stones of failed coaches and coordinators from previous stints in most recent years. And now Chase Blackburn, seemingly given the disastrous year of the Rams special teams, is kind of the mind gem that Thanos has now collected from Vision, if I recall, Infinity War. And I know there's probably one person watching the podcast right now that was like, man, I haven't seen Infinity War. Why'd you spoil the movie? And I'm like, yeah, well, everybody on the planet, Matt Ryan's planet that he's the president of football on has already seen Infinity War. So I apologize for spoiling an 8-year-old movie for you. But it does feel like Kevin Stefanski is now doing this on purpose, right? You've seen it on offense. You're now seeing it on special teams where it's like, come to Atlanta and you can resurrect your career. You're not seeing it quite on defense because Jeff Ulbrich's like, no, you can't play with my toys, Kevin. These are my guys. But everywhere else, it does feel like Kevin Stefanski in this mantra, they're out to prove something. And hopefully we will see them prove themselves to be like, yes, we are coming from all these bad organizations. And the minute we get to Atlanta, it's all going to click. And I would like to believe that to be true, but you guys know I'm naturally skeptical. So I sit here still skeptical, being like, okay, let's see if this works. But, it's easy to sit here and go, especially when you're talking about organizations like the Browns and the Jets, and be like, oh, these are dumpster fires of organizations. That doesn't really fly when you talk about the Rams, where Chase Blackburn's coming from. But we'll sort of see if Atlanta can prove itself to. I don't think Atlanta's a dumpster fire, but historically speaking, let's just say they're the trash can in the break room, and you see a little smoke coming from, and you're like, you smell something? Did someone burn some popcorn? Right? No, that's that tiny little trash can in the corner of the room that's on fire. Right? It's not a full-fledged, call the fire department dumpster fire, but it's just like, okay, let someone go grab the fire extinguisher before this gets out of hand. That's basically what I'm saying the Falcons are. And so it's a little harder for me to buy back in that like it's all going to work, but that's me. You guys know it takes forever for me to really buy in on this football team. And it's funny because I talked about this over the weekend. Like the difference between you and I is that you guys immediately buy in every offseason, and it takes me like 6 months to buy back in because I've been burned far too many times. I've been dealing with this emotional damage that this Falcon team has inflicted on me for the last few decades. And I'm always like, nope, you're not going to get me again. And it's just funny because I heard so many Falcon fans today on Wednesday after Tommy Rees's presser being like, you know what? I liked what I heard from Tommy Rees. So I'm starting to like this hire, and it was like, that's exactly what I'm talking about, illustrating that immediate buyback in. And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that is a perfect example of the difference between you and I is that immediate buyback in. And so we'll see if Chase Blackburn and this island of misfit toys, the infinity stones of bad coaches, it works here in Atlanta. And if Kevin Stefanski is like, you know what, we're going to do it. And I was like, again, I would love to be sitting here a year from now eating that plate of crow and being like, oh, yeah, the special teams unit was really good. You take two bad coaches and you put them together and it makes one good coach, right? Like that's how that works. So we'll see if that works for the Atlanta Falcons moving forward. But we'll continue today's episode talking a little bit more about that defensive coach and his philosophy, not when it comes to building a coaching staff, but his philosophy when it comes to, does he value players more or does he value the scheme more? And he leans players, but I think that's a good strategy and good philosophy to have. But I do think there's one area where that can go a little too far. We'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So wouldn't it be nice if doing your taxes was just as easy as it's going to be for Tommy Rees to hand the ball off to Bijan Robinson? Well, with TurboTax Full Service, you can hand off your taxes to a local expert and not have to stress from start to finish. It's like handing the ball off to Bijan Robinson and being like, of course, this is easy. This is how you coordinate a good offense. You just give the ball to Bijan, right? Instead of spending hours trying to figure out your forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They're going to handle everything, your W-2s, your self-employed forms. They're going to handle every deduction. All you got to do is upload your documents, go about the rest of your day doing whatever you want, watching Bijan Robinson highlights, and you can get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver, and it's going to give you peace of mind, just like handing the ball off to Bijan Robinson. So for a limited time, get your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life by visiting turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. And the Winter Games are officially here. And if you're anything like me, you're locking in for the events that you only get to see on the biggest stage every 4 years. Today, I've been watching, curling, luge, doubles, luge, hockey, and so much more. And it's the only thing that I can do every 4 years with the Winter Games. The intensity, the drama, it's all there. And FanDuel is going to allow you to stay connected with the action. It's going to have you fully locked into every competition, whether you're rooting for your home country or you're just, rooting for that underdog that you just like the cut of that person's jib, right? Knowing nothing about speed skating or whatever it is. FanDuel is going to keep the entire Olympics experience engaging from start to finish. So with the Winter Games on, there's no better way to follow them than with FanDuel. Just head on over to FanDuel.com. FanDuel, play your game. So I got this question from an insider who asked about a very specific comment that Jeff Ulbrich had in his presser on Wednesday. And again, it was, to paraphrase, he was basically talking about, valuing scheme versus player, right? Do you have a scheme and then you add players that fit your scheme, or do you just get good players and then you build a scheme around them? And Jeff Ulbrich basically said the way he used to think was scheme over players, build a scheme and get the players and the body types that fit that scheme. And nowadays he thinks it's more players, just get good players and you build the scheme around it. And I think that's the correct idea. I think the idea of that is a good idea. I do think that idea can go too far, but on that notion, just sort of reaffirming, I think what Jeff Ulbrich, and he said specifically, I think he talked about how when he first got to New York, he had this philosophy, but I've heard over the years, when going revisiting the debacle, that was the Falcons selection of Takk McKinley over TJ Watt. And I think that's a perfect example of that wrong philosophy of valuing scheme over players, right? And it's funny to me because like I've heard people basically connect the dots that one of the deciding factors in why the Falcons chose Takk McKinley over TJ Watt, beyond just, the simple fact that he was the consensus higher ranked player in the draft that particular year. But again, no one cares about that now, based off of how their careers have gone. But because Takk McKinley, when he was a freshman at UCLA, Jeff Ulbrich was also the coach there. And so like Jeff Ulbrich had some influence on like, yeah, get this guy. I coached him. He's going to be a good one for you. And so it's just interesting to me that kind of reaffirms what we're talking about, where I think this was the old philosophy that they did want a more physical body type in Takk McKinley. And that's what led them down that road, in addition to all these other factors, as opposed to TJ Watt. So just reaffirming, that sort of notion that that's how Jeff Ulbrich used to think. But as I said, I think this can go a little too far, right? When it's like the idea is right, but I do think you can, I still think you do need to value building complementary skill sets. And, the obvious example that you've heard us complain about a lot here on the podcast is, all these shrimp corners, right? That the Falcons have, all these short corners, that the Falcons seem to value smaller corners than they seem to value bigger corners. Like they have invested in bigger corners. They've gotten Keith Taylor and Kevin King and Jeff Okudah. They traded a 5th round pick for Jeff Okudah. But they've also used 3 4th round picks in theory on smaller corners in Darren Hall, right? Clark Phillips, Billy Bowman, D. Alford, Mike Hughes, Casey Hayward. These were not particularly big corners. Casey Hayward's basically average size, so calling him a small corner is probably not fair. He's not a shrimp, right? He's at least a lobster or something like that. A crawfish or something. Anyway, we're not going to use too many crustacean, things. But like to me, basically, it's like the Falcons. I think the point is the Falcons have focused too much on one specific body type in their cornerback room, and I think that's where it can go too far, where it's just like you're just basically, we're just going to take the best player, and it doesn't matter whether or not they have complementary skill sets. And specifically when we're talking about edge rushers, like I think you need to have a mix of like power and speed guys and technical guys. And really with the whole entire defensive line, you want to build a unit that is complementary to each other, no different than when you're looking at your cornerback room or your wide receiver room, where you want to have different body types and different skill sets and whatnot. And so I think on your defensive line, you want to have a healthy mix of power and speed and finesse, so that you can mix and match your players in and out of the lineup, and you can take advantage of different lineups, because there's going to be tackles that you face that struggle against speed. There's going to be tackles that are going to struggle against power. There's going to be tackles that struggle against technique and all that stuff. And you want to have the types of bodies in your room that can take advantage of that. And so that's where I mean, where it's like, I do think the idea of players over scheme matters, but you can go too far. And I think, to me, this was personally, in my opinion, a reason why the Jets defense kind of fell off towards the end, is because they didn't have enough of those power players to complement the sort of speed and finesse guys that they had on their defensive front. And it's one of the reasons why, like, I think their defense struggled towards the end. And basically it's like, it's basically the idea of like, speed guys are very valuable on like 3rd and long, right? You want to get 3rd and 7, pin your ears back, get after the quarterback, boom, right? Those speed guys are going to be valuable. But if you have too many of those guys, they're going to have less value, because you're never going to get to 3rd and long, because those guys are going to get pushed around on 1st and 2nd down, right? And you're not going to get the stops on early downs to get the defense in an advantageous situation to be able to use that speed on 3rd and long. So that's kind of what I mean when I'm saying like you can go a little too far with just basically, we're just going to value the best players, and we'll figure it out with the scheme. It's like you can kind of make it harder on yourselves if you go too far in that regard. So on that spectrum, it's like, yes, you want to value it the way that Jeff Ulbrich, but I'm just basically saying I think you can go too far with that. So those were my thoughts that I shared with the Locked On Falcons insider on that specific issue. And then like the last point I'll say is like watching the Seahawks just bully that Patriots offensive line. It's like that's kind of the thing. I want to see the Falcons add more bullies. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, well, you're going to take a lesser player that just because he's more physical. And I think that's kind of the point that Jeff Ulbrich is making. Like, don't take it the lesser player, right? And so I'm not saying that you take the lesser player, but if it's even, right? If it's even, give me the bully, right? Because we've talked before about, like, especially with offensive tackles, where like the thing that they're most worried about is not speed, it's not technique, it's a guy going through their chest, right? It's a guy caving in that chest and watching it, and having that ability to just basically wear on an offensive line. And you saw this over the course of the game with the Patriots, where they were just like physically demoralized throughout that game. Like, give me more of those types in Atlanta. And so, I want more of those types, but I'm not going to sit here and say like you have to only add those players, right? Just get the best players. But, if you can if you can veer a little bit towards more power and physicality up front, I think that will ultimately benefit you in the end. So I thought that was an interesting tidbit that Jeff Ulbrich added in his presser that we didn't get to earlier on the podcast. But tomorrow we'll get into more stuff on the podcast. Again, this is the beauty of the offseason. Don't know what we're going to talk about tomorrow. We're just kind of making it up as we go. So there's plenty of topics that we could get into. So make sure you stay tuned here on YouTube or where we listen to podcasts so that you do not miss that episode. And of course, check out Locked On NFL and check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below so you can get some perks, including an ad-free version of the pod. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every